Chapter 17. I Can't Stay Here. It is not your place to alter the course of this world, nor to save those marked for death. I turned in a circle, trying to determine where the deep, stern voice had come from. Nothing met my gaze, only blackness for as far as I could see. Reaching out with my hands, I tried to find something to grasp, yet only emptiness met my fingers. Am I dead? I asked, surprised by the calm of my voice. I had the impression of amusement, though I could neither see nor hear it. You have not yet passed from the plane of the living. Then where the hell am I, and what the hell is going on? I huffed. This is not hell, at least not as I understand it from your world's dogma. What's going on? I repeated in a slow, angry tone. Your actions have been as such that I felt it is time to speak with you, he spoke, the sternness returning. And just who are you? I turned around, trying to pinpoint the direction the voice was coming from. But it seemed to be all around me. Where are you? This talking to a disembodied voice thing is cliched and creepy. At once I was standing back in the forest at Parth Glen, the scattered bodies of orcs in Urukai all around. Laid against a nearby tree was the bloodied body of Boromir, his sightless eyes still gazing up at the treetops. I stepped towards him when another man suddenly appeared beside Boromir's prone form. He's dead, but the others should have returned to his body to the river, I said lowly. Why is his body still there? The other man waved a dark hand over the body, and it disappeared. Indeed, they have given the son of Gondor what burial they could, the deep voice responded. He turned to face me, and I took a shocked step back at the face that matched the deep, resonating voice. James Earl Jones? I exclaimed. Fuck, I've gone crazy again, haven't I? Or I'm still crazy? He looked down at himself in confusion. Who, pray tell, is James Earl Jones? You don't know who you are? I couldn't believe I was even having this conversation. I certainly know who I am. However, as one of the Valar, your mortal mind cannot withstand my true form. I appear to mortals as they wish to see me. It is your mind that has chosen this form. And my subconscious chose James Earl Jones? It would seem. Huh. You do kind of sound like him, but I suppose that's my subconscious at work too. I looked at him suspiciously. If you say, Lane, I am your father, I'm gonna know I'm crazy. I do not understand this reference. I shook my head. Why am I here? Why are you here? To help you understand why you cannot interfere with fate. His voice and face narrowed, bordering on angry as he spoke. You mean trying to protect Boromir? Precisely. What did I do wrong? What would it have hurt? I demanded, stepping away from the scene of carnage and looking back down the hill. I'd come running up to save Boromir. He came to stand beside me as we gazed through the forest. All things exist in a tenuous balance, he explained, his voice taking on a flat effect. Strength and weakness, light and dark, life and death. Each must counter the other. Change the course of one, and the pendulum will swing wildly in the other direction to achieve balance once more. Saving Boromir really would have changed that much? I asked, not turning to look at the James Earl Jones doppelganger. It was hard enough having this conversation while listening to his voice. Must I truly answer that? I sighed, knowing the truth. No. Knowing it didn't change my regret at the necessity of his death, Boromir remaining alive would have been a domino effect. Without it, Denethor would not be driven mad by grief and would possibly fight Aragorn's rise to the throne. And ever loyal had Boromir lived, he would have sided with his father. Aragorn's people might very well be split on their own loyalty, whether to support their ruling steward or their returning king. What of Faramir's happiness? Without Denethor's grief driving him to madness, Faramir might not be sent out to reclaim Osgiliath, and if he were not injured, he would not be in the healing rooms to meet Eowyn. And if Boromir still lived, he would not regain the honor he'd tarnished in attempt to take the ring. In death, he would receive an illustrious funeral performed by celebrated warriors and friends. As a soldier myself, I knew it was no little thing to live without honor. Just because I know what the outcome had to be doesn't mean it was easy to live with, I finally told him. The things must be done are oft the hardest to live with, he agreed. Keeping their courses from being traveled, and you may very well die with it. This is the lesson you must remember. You cannot change the fate without consequence. Hearing the spoken and unspoken threat, I turned to face him. If you're so worried about me screwing the fate of this world up, why don't you just send me back to my world? I snarled. Why am I even here? That I cannot say. How you came to be here is puzzling, even among the Valar, he calmly responded. Look, how doesn't really matter to me. Just send me back. He finally turned to look at me, slowly shaking his head. Do you truly wish to return to your world? No, but I don't want to screw up this world either. It is not so simple a task to transport you from one world to another. And yet, some old gypsy woman could do it. Come on. Just what kind of power do you have, James? He grunted. The magic that brought you here was an accidental deviation in powers. Great. It's an accident that I'm even here. Where do I belong now? It may have been incidental that you found your way here, but you have etched out a path here. Removing you from the circles of this world would not be easy nor pleasant. Yet I fear it must be done. The world of your birth must also be the one of your death, else balance shall be lost. So what am I supposed to do? What's going to happen to me? The Valar have not decided. We are split on the matter. Except for you not so subtly threatening me about changing the course of this world, I commented. He tilted his head as he looked at me. Do you know who I am? You mean you're not James Earl Jones? I laughed derisively. He continued staring, a disconcerted sight since he wore so famous a face. I crossed my arms. I'm guessing by things you've said that you're deaf, although if you are, I don't know why my mind doesn't picture you with a scythe and black robe. He tilted his head and stared at me, seeming to see into my very being. I do not understand this portrayal of death in your world. Yet I would venture you do not see me as such because this visage is meant to be frightening, and I do not believe you fear dying any longer. I shrugged. I openly welcomed it once. I guess I have lost that kind of fear of you, death. I hold dominion over more than simply death. I was called Namil, the judge of the dead, and keeper of souls in my halls of waiting. So you really don't look like James Earl Jones, I wondered. He stared at me and I gazed back. The illusion wavered. Beneath it was a face that held all the features of every face that had ever been, and none of them at the same time. Almost like an image in rippling water. It was ever-changing. Then the illusion slipped back in place. I stepped back nervously. I am neither fearsome nor evil. I deal evil to evil, but those of goodness receive justice in my halls. All receive justice in one form or another, he explained. But you're still warning me not to mess with fate. His face darkened. I am explaining to you that regardless of what the other Valar decide, if you change the balance of the lives under my dominion, I will deal you a fitting end in return. He stepped back, and suddenly I was no longer in Parth Green, but staring up at the gray sky as my back connected roughly with the ground. We're sick of carting these prisoners around, the large Uruk that had tossed me to the ground proclaimed as he straightened. Even in the gray sky, the small amount of light was too bright. My head pounded as my vision blurred and dark spots flashed in my vision. As the throbbing in my head continued to beat in erratic tempo, I rolled over onto my side and heaved the contents of my stomach. Even when my stomach was empty, my abdominal muscles continued to constrict as I dry heaved. I forced deep breaths and closed my eyes, eventually regaining some control, though the pounding in my head continued. Still, on my side, I opened my eyes again to take in our surroundings. I pulled my shirt up and glanced at the purple bruises on my stomach. The orc must have carried me over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Rolling over, I was relieved to see the hobbits. Merry appeared to be sporting a similar wound to the back of his head, and hadn't quite come around yet. But Pippin was worriedly looking about. It's okay, Pip. Everything will be fine, I whispered to Pippin. Quiet, you, an orc growled as a kick landed in my hip when I rolled away from it. I rolled further away and gritted my teeth, refusing to let them hear my pain. As I clenched my teeth and waited for the pain to pass, I considered my dream and vision, or whatever the hell it had been. Maybe I'd had some bad mushrooms or something. Was it real, or had it been a dream brought on by whatever damage my brain had received when I was knocked out? That made more sense, after all. If Morgan Freeman played God, maybe it made sense that my mind would come up with the Darth Vader as Death, or Nama, whatever. I could hear the guttural voices of the orcs arguing over something, so I rolled back again and listened. Orders are we take the halflings and the woman to our master. They are not for killing. I looked over at Pippin's terrified face. It'll be fine, I told him in a bare whisper. Then one of the orcs cut the bands of the ropes at my ankles, grabbing my throat. He yanked upwards as I scrambled to get my feet under me. They must be good for sport, then, said the orc, still squeezing my throat from behind me. And only one kind of sport a woman could be good for. He laughed then at his proclamation, a sick, distorted sound. My hands were bound in front of me, but I still managed to throw my right elbow into the orc's side hard enough to loosen his grip on my throat. When his hand fell away, I spun around to face him as I backed away. The orc snarled at me and started towards the hobbits. I don't have to kill them to get sport out of the halflings. He pulled back his leg to deliver a kick to Pippin, but I stepped back towards him, swinging my leg forward to block the kick with my shin. Pick on someone your own size, I growled. He whirled towards me, fist raised, swinging towards me in a punch. I raised my bound hands and pivoted, letting the blow glance by. I'm going to kill those halflings and you, the orc yelled, his anger escalating. As he stepped towards the hobbits again, I stepped in front of him and drove my bound hands up into the middle of his face, enjoying the wet crunch of the creature's nose driving upward. I'd put all the force in my arms into the blow and revealed at the sight of the orc crumpling lifeless to the earth. None of you touch those hobbits, I bellowed. Several more orcs rushed towards me then, but the large black orc, who seemed to be in charge, stepped in between, his large sword swinging as he decapitated several of his advancing comrades. Put up your weapons, the large orc shouted when the fighting had abated. No more of this. We make for the stair. Straight west. We will run day and night. Is that clear? I glanced at the hobbits, watching as Pippin covertly used the knife of a dead orc to cut the bindings of his wrists and re-loop them over his hands to hide his deed. Attaboy, Pip. I looked up and grinned at him before wiping the expression from my face. Order, or fast smile thereof, finally restored. The large orc, Uglik, announced we were moving again and ordered the hobbits picked up again. I glanced around at all the many orcs, but knew they were too great in number to possibly stop them. Merry and Pippin were roughly slung over the backs of orcs, but none of the orcs stepped any closer to me. You run now, Uglik growled at me. What does your master want with me? The master thinks you know something and wants your knowledge. Now run. My body ran cold at his words, but I knew enough to realize I couldn't let my mind dwell on it. Having no other choice, I nodded and fell in line with the orcs, running awkwardly because of my bound hands. At least they hadn't been smart enough to rebind my hands behind me. By the time the orcs stopped again and tossed the hobbits to the ground, I was heaving from my awkward running and battered body, and my head felt like it was about to split open. As I bent over to regain my breath, I watched them cut the ropes on the feet of the hobbits. Merry was starting to come around, and one of the orcs cruelly yanked the bandage from his head and smeared a dark ointment over his head wound. I was so focused on Merry that I didn't notice another orc coming up behind me until the harsh and swift kick to the back of my knees forced me to collapse. With a rough yank at my nape, the orc slathered a familiar foul-smelling goo to my own head wound before grabbing my scalp, yanking my head back to pour an equally foul liquid down my throat. Sputtering, I leaned forward and kicked out blindly at the orc, barely connecting, but thankful for even that little bit. At least he walked away. Hello, Pippin, Lane, Merry forced out cheerfully. So you've both come on this little expedition too? Where do we get bed and breakfast? Hello, Merry, I returned. No bed, and I think that was breakfast. None of that, Uglik snarled. No more talk. Soon we were running on again, 3 guards around each of us. I kept the 2 hobbits in front of me, wanting to keep an eye on them. I watched with glee as Pippin dove from the pathway under a brush, pulling his brooch from his cloak and dropping it on the ground as the orcs pulled him back into line. Pippin was becoming willy and maturing before my very eyes. Hours, or even days later, I'd long since lost track. We finally stopped again. We were all given stale bread, more foul-smelling draught, and what appeared to be pieces of raw, dried flesh. The hobbits flung the meat away, unnerved by its ghastly appearance. I flung it away, too, reminded too much of my previous stay in captivity. At least this time, I had the hobbits to fight for and protect. I wasn't utterly alone this time. On we ran again, but now there is a real air of nervousness among the orcs, for now we were being tracked by a band of horsemen from Ronan. As we ran, the riders hemmed the band of orcs in against the forest, some of the riders firing their bows and bringing down the orcs as we ran. One arrow sliced across my right bicep, painfully grazing my arm, as I silently cursed the aim of the Roman who didn't know we were captives among the orcs. The next time we stopped, I gratefully collapsed on the ground and shut my eyes, letting sleep take me. The hobbits had been carried on and off, but I had been forced to run ever since I'd come to. Commotion and loud crashes suddenly woke me. I sat up to see the orcs running about as the Roman attacked. Pippin had his hands free and was freeing Merry from his bonds. Pippin ran towards me and pulled at my bonds, but the ropes were tightened from my running and pulling at the bonds, making the skin raw and swollen. I pushed him away, knowing they couldn't waste time. "Go, Pip. You and Merry get out of here." We can't leave you, Lane," he protested. "I can take care of myself, Pip. You two have to make for the woods. You'll be trampled if you stay here. I'll be fine. Go and don't stop," I ordered, pushing him away. Thankfully, he listened, turning and grabbing Merry as they ran away together. My nap had given me a slight boost in energy, and my adrenaline was kicking in, erasing the feel of the aches, pains, and the wounds that still bled in favor of my instinct to survive. I stood just as an orc grabbed me and delivered a punishing blow to my midsection. I turned away from it, but the blow still caught me low in the ribs. Spinning and forcing my elbow into the orc, I cast about for a weapon. Nothing was in sight. Then I remembered the ivory hairpin Galadriel had given me, long, straight, and sharp. I reached over my head and yanked the hairpiece out, my braid uncoiling down my back. The orc ran towards me again, knife raised overhand. My bound hands thrust my makeshift stiletto into an underhand motion, driving it up under the orc's ribcage. I slid my bloody makeshift weapon into my belt, grabbed the knife from the orc's limp hand, wedging it between my knees as I sawed on my bonds, cutting my hands in my haste, but my hands were finally free. A horse streaked past me as I stood, the swinging sword of its rider barely missing me. With a low growl, I grabbed a discarded orc sword, swinging the heavy, coarse blade at the nearest orc. Best way to make the Rohans see I wasn't an orc was to start fighting against the orcs. I pushed pain and fatigue from my mind, focusing instead on each movement and each placement of my feet as I wove around the dwelling orcs, cutting through one after another. Hearing footfalls and heavy breathing behind me, I spun and slashed downward with my heavy blade, the sword catching against the block of another sword. I started to pull back and attack again when my brain finally registered what my eyes were telling me, that my blade had clashed with another mortal's blade, a human. One of the Rohans stared back at me from on foot, his eyes wide with shock as he took in my appearance. I looked around to see that the last of the orcs had finally being decapitated by the roving horsemen, their spears darting out at anything still moving. My blade fell away, dropping from my hands that once again registered its overwhelming heft. The Roharic soldier on foot said something to me, but I didn't speak his language and stared blankly back at him. He stepped closer. "Are you badly injured, my lady?" he asked in Westron. I glanced around again, then down at myself. My clothes and skin were streaked black and red. The stinking black blood of the orcs covered me in like a canvas, with my own red blood swirling electrically in homage to its abstract painting. Even the wound to my arm that I'd received that day we'd been captured was bleeding again. My wound too, no doubt. My head wound too, no doubt. There hadn't been time to consider my wounds much before, but now I could feel the ickiness of dried blood on my head and an arm that hadn't been washed away. Now more would join it. "You are safe, my lady," the man told me as he cautiously approached. I must have seemed either too dangerous or too fragile for him to approach so carefully, and I feared it was the latter. "I'm Lane," I informed him as I felt my knees buckled. The ground was fast approaching as my eyes fluttered and closed again. My eyes opened lazily to the sight of a thatched roof. Strange thoughts and emotions of concern and worry overwhelmed me. For several panicked moments, I was afraid I couldn't shut the thoughts out, but a little bit at a time, I was able to rebuild my barriers and close off the thoughts. As my body shook with the effort of closing the thoughts out, I was startled to realize that this was the first time I'd heard anyone's thoughts since I'd first woken up in the captivity of the orcs. Shocking to realize that I hadn't noticed its absence until it came rushing back. Was it possible my head injury had disabled my disability? If so, maybe a splitting headache was a small price to pay for the normality of not hearing others' thoughts. I pushed up on my elbow just as a woman came bustling into the room with a tray. She laid it down and rushed up to me, clucking in what I assumed now was Roic, and pushing me back into the bed. "Where am I?" I asked her as I allowed her to push me down again. Her head tilted as she looked at me. "Lord Airmore said he wasn't sure if you spoke Roic." My eyebrows shot up at that. I wondered if he was the one who'd been fighting the orcs on foot before I blacked out. "You are in Edras, my lady, and have been for 2 days. 2 days?" I repeated in surprise. "Aye, you've been resting for 2 days, and need many more." She spoke Western well, but her accent was heavy, forcing me to really listen to catch all of her words. "How did I get here?" I asked the plump woman as she bustled about. Her hair had probably once been a stunning strawberry blonde, for it still held the rumor of the color. But the color had faded and streaked with gray. She came back to the bed I had been laid on and carrying a bowl of broth and a goblet. I reached for the goblet first, eager to chase away the cotton mouth sensation. Apparently, it wasn't water that met my lips, but light, sweet mead. "One of the riders of Lord Amour's Erod was sent back to Medsolid to bring you to safety of the Lady Awen. She tended your wounds, but bade me keep you safe within my house," she explained. I was grateful her speech had slowed down, making her easier to understand. "What do you mean she bade you keep me safe?" I repeated as I set the goblet down and slowly started on the broth. I felt famished, but my stomach had been empty for days and was already clenching at the liquid, unexpectedly filling it. The woman leaned closer and whispered conspiracially, "'Tis no longer safe within the halls of Medslid. I worked within those halls since I was a child, but the Lady Awen had sent nearly all the servants away. The others did not realize, but she fears for their safety and honor, while those with the twisted tongues lurk about. The king no longer knows friend from foe. They say just this morning that Lord Airmore was arrested and jailed upon his return." She shook her head sadly and continued, "No, 'tis not safe to be about the halls of Medslid, for those who have an association with his lordship. You're safest to remain here until you've healed, child. A miracle it is you yet live for after your capacity among such foul creatures." "What do I call you?" I asked, rather than thinking about what was already done. "Oh, bless me," she flustered. "You can call me Bride. I forgot my manners. And how should I address you, my lady?" "Lane, just Lane, none of that lady business." "Of course, whatever you wish, child." I smiled at her motherly tone and pushed the bowl away. "Thank you for your kindness, but I think that's all my stomach can handle for now." She gathered the bowl and patted my shoulder as she stood to leave. "Rest, dear." I waited until she closed the door and drew back the bedspread. I was dressed in a loose, undyed cotton shift. My left forearm was wrapped in bandages as my right bicep as was my right bicep when I pulled up the sleeve. Wiggling on the bed, I pulled up the shift to examine the shades of purple and green covering my stomach. Where an orc had kicked me in the hip was still dark and nearly black, and quite tender even to movement. Without much flesh there, I knew the bone itself was bruised and would be slow to heal. But as I sat up, the sharpest pain was the grating in my lower left ribs. I gasped and struggled to control my breathing. Probing the rib, I found nothing out of place, but the pain was so sharp, I knew the rib had to be cracked even if it wasn't completely broken. My head still seemed to be splitting open, but I could feel the threads of stitches along the gash. No bandages could accurately stay on the back of my head, but it had been stitched well and didn't appear to be bleeding. Altogether, I felt like I'd gone a few rounds with a meat grinder and lost, but I knew no permanent damage was done. Rest would be a wonderful luxury, but there was nothing so badly injured that I'd do any harm to it by getting up. My joints and muscles felt sore and stiff from the inactivity. The bruises would hurt, no doubt, but my muscles would eventually loosen if I got up and stretched them some. I stood on shaky legs and allowed my muscles to re-familiarize themselves with holding my weight. I felt like an old woman as I crossed the room to stand by the short dresser. Several of my things were laid out on top, and my boots on the ground next to a stool. My clothes seemed to be gone, but miraculously, my cloak was clean and neatly folded on the dresser. The clothes I assumed were torn and bloodied beyond repair, but I was shocked the cloak wasn't as well. My jackknife from my boot was on the dresser, along with the photos I'd kept wrapped in soft suede in my jerkin. Pulling my shift away from my chest, I reaffirmed that the necklace Galadriel had given me and my dog tags were also still in place. My fingers lightly caressed the long ivory hairpin Galadriel had given me, lying beside Andrith's shorter pin. I hadn't understood Galadriel's knowing smiles when I'd coiled my braid and slid the hairpin through, but I realize now, she probably known just how her gift would be useful to me. It was no longer streaked with black blood. Bride must have cleaned it as well. It was once again clean, polished ivory. A plain dark brown dress and unbleached underskirts were also laid out on top of the dresser with a cream-colored blouse. Determined to stay up and moving, I reluctantly exchanged the shift for the dress. Not much of an improvement in my opinion, but at least I'd be able to walk outside without creating an uproar. I was just finishing tying the laces down the sides of the dress when I felt the pressing of several minds closing in. Moving to listen at the bedroom door, I heard several deep voices making obvious demands in Rourke. "The child is still healing," Bard's angry voice announced, suddenly becoming clear over the din of angry Rourke words. "Just what crime can she possibly be guilty of? She's not even awoken yet." I realized my caretaker was deliberately speaking loudly and in Westruun, so I would hear her words and take warning. I just prayed the guards didn't pay it any attention. "Our orders are to bring the woman before Lord Grima and King Theoden. There her fate will be decided." My breath caught. I knew Grima was in league with Saruman, who had in fact ordered my own capture as well as the hobbits. I still don't know why, but I was damn sure I didn't want to wait around to find out from Grima. I shoved my boots on, thankful the skirt of my dress was long and would hopefully hide the boots not made for the dresses. My jackknife and bundle of photos I slid into my boot next, and then knotted my hair into a bun, sliding the ivory pin through the knot. Adris' hairpin I quickly slid onto my necklace and tucked into the blouse. I cast about the room, but had no other possessions but for my cloak. I hadn't seen my bag or weapons since the day at the Parth Glen, and I regretted their loss, though it would make my escape easier now. The bedroom had no outside door, but I did have a small window with the shutters pulled close. Carefully opening them, I peeked out to see the back of the house I was in, but was butted closely against the back of another, leaving a narrow walkway, which was blissfully empty. With gritted teeth and many choice words under my breath, I hoisted myself onto the windowsill and finally through the window onto the ground. My ribs and arms were screaming from the new maneuver, demanding that I stop and rest. But I could hear the voices of the guards getting louder in anger as they argued with Bride. She wouldn't be able to hold them off much longer. Shuffling down the narrow alleyway with my cloak under one arm, I made my way towards the concentration of noise in the heart of the city. It would be easier to get lost in the crowd. As I skirted the edge of a house into a bigger thoroughfare where I snatched an apron and a large headscarf off a clothesline. They were still slightly damp, but dry enough. The headscarf was overlarge, but would nicely hide my features and hair, including the distinctive ivory hairpin. Thus attired and walking with my head down, I was able to disappear into the tide of Roark people, bustling down the road as they walked about their city. As a scout, I knew how to blend in with the local populace and avoid capture. It would be no difference here. I sighed deeply as I considered my situation, and then cursed myself as the action caused a stabbing pain in the ring that ran along my ribs. I could avoid Grima's men for a few days, and then Legolas would arrive with the others, and I would be safe. Provided I caught no one's attention between now and then. Piece of cake. I was only half starved from my time with the orcs, and damaged enough that my gait would resemble the hobble of an old woman. Yeah, piece of cake, all right. Maybe I should walk up to Med Salud now and tell them to just throw me in with Aramor.